Alright folks, welcome back to Boss Economic World, the show where we slice through the economic jargon like a hot knife through a ridiculously overpriced artisanal butter. Today, we're going to talk about something that's all around us, but we rarely see it. It's a story about destruction, beer, and how a pile of gravel can explain more than a third of America's economic growth this century. Stick around. This one's a doozy. The date is October 24th, 2025. It's a crisp autumn day. But picture this, rewind about a year, to the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. This beast of a storm didn't just knock on North Carolina's door, it kicked it off the hinges, tore through the living room, and threw the furniture into the neighbor's yard. 8 months after it hit, I took a trip down to Asheville. Now, Asheville is this cool, funky mountain town. It's famous for its arts scene, the Biltmore Estate, and a frankly obscene number of craft breweries. It's a place you go to escape. But when I visited in May, there was no escaping the ghost of Helene. Debris was still piled high. I walked along an industrial strip on Riverside Drive, right by the French Broad River. Or what was left of it. Auto parts shops looked like they'd been put in a blender. Warehouses were skeletal remains. The air still tasted of damp and decay. It was a masterclass in devastation. And as I'm standing there, trying to process this monumental, $60 billion mess in North Carolina alone, my eyes land on something profoundly boring. The gravel. The ballast, the crushed stone that sits under the railroad tracks. And in a landscape of total ruin, this gravel was new. It was clean. It was perfectly laid. And right there, standing on the side of a busted-up road, staring at a pile of rocks, the whole picture snapped into focus. That gravel wasn't just gravel. It was a signal. It was the first beat of a returning pulse. See, Helene had turned western North Carolina into an island. No power, no internet, no phones, no roads. Total isolation. But new gravel under the tracks meant one thing: the trains were coming back. And if the trains could run, as Norfolk Southern had just announced they could haul out the wreckage, the mountains of felled trees and twisted metal. More importantly, they could bring in the sinews of reconstruction, lumber, steel, concrete, heavy machinery. They could bring in grain and malt. And if you can bring in malt, Asheville's legendary beer economy can start brewing again. And as we all know, where there is beer, there is civilization. This, my friends, is the disaster industrial complex in action. Now, that term sounds ominous, doesn't it? It conjures images of shadowy figures profiting from misery. And we'll get to that. But at its core, it's the sprawling, invisible network of supply chains, companies, and laborers that kicks into gear when society gets knocked flat on its back. I was in Asheville because of some mind-blowing research from Andrew John Stevenson over at Bloomberg Intelligence. Get ready for this number. Stevenson's analysis shows that a staggering 36% of all U.S. economic growth since the year 2000 can be linked to spending on recovering from disasters or preparing for the next one. Let me repeat that, because it sounds insane. Over one-third of the growth of the world's largest economy for the last quarter century comes from cleaning up messes. Not from inventing the next iPhone, not from building shiny new tech campuses, but from putting things back together after they've been smashed, flooded, or burned. When I first read that, I thought it had to be a typo. But the more you look, the more it makes a terrifying kind of sense. This isn't just about FEMA writing checks. This is about the Home Depots and Lowe's shipping trainloads of drywall and 2x4s. It's about Caterpillar selling fleets of excavators. It's about AT&T and Verizon replacing tens of thousands of miles of fiber optic cable. It's about environmental remediation firms, demolition crews, trucking companies, civil engineers, and yes, the quarries that produce the new gravel for the railroad tracks. It's a perfect real-world example of what the great economist Milton Friedman was talking about with his famous pencil essay. Friedman's point was that no single person on Earth knows how to make something as simple as a pencil. The wood comes from one place, the graphite from another, the rubber from a third, the paint, the metal band. It takes a global, coordinated, and completely unconscious effort of thousands of people. Well, as the economist Matthew Kahn at USC told me, so it is with disaster recovery. To get one keg of beer flowing again at a brewery in Asheville requires a global village. The brewery's heroic staff worked around the clock, sure. But they also needed a new fermentation tank, which was built by a company in Germany using steel from China, shipped on a vessel flagged in Panama, delivered by a trucker from Tennessee, all financed by an insurance payout processed in Hartford, Connecticut. That, in a nutshell, is the disaster industrial complex. It's the customers of customers of customers, and the suppliers of suppliers of suppliers, all lurching into action. Now, the sharp-eyed economists in our audience are probably screaming at their screens right now. Boss. That's the broken window fallacy. And you're not wrong. The broken window fallacy is an old economic parable. A kid throws a rock and breaks a shopkeeper's window. People say, oh, but look. This is good for the economy. Now the shopkeeper has to pay a glazier, who then has more money to spend, and so on. The fallacy, of course, is that this ignores what the shopkeeper would have spent the money on if the window hadn't been broken: a new suit, perhaps, or an investment in his business. The community is poorer by one window. You don't create prosperity by destroying things. So, is this 36% of GDP growth just a giant, nationwide broken window? Is it fake growth? The answer is, it's complicated. And this is where the story gets really interesting. What we're seeing isn't just replacement. It's replacement with upgrades. It's forced modernization. When Hurricane Helene rips out a 50-year-old power grid, they don't put the same old vulnerable, above-ground poles back in. They bury the cables. They build a smarter, more resilient grid. When a flood wipes out a highway, the new one is built 2 feet higher, with better drainage. Old, storm-vulnerable vacation homes are replaced with structures built to modern hurricane codes. This isn't just fixing the broken window. This is replacing a single-pane piece of glass with triple-glazed, hurricane-proof laminated safety glass with a smart tint. The community isn't just back to where it was, it's more resilient. It has leveled up. This spending isn't just a recovery cost, it's a massive, reactive, and incredibly inefficient investment in infrastructure. The problem is, the scale of this investment is exploding. Let's look at the scorecard for just the first half of 2025. According to data from the nonprofit Climate Central, who heroically picked up the billion-dollar disaster database after the federal government quietly abandoned it, the U.S. has already seen over $101 billion in losses from severe storms and fires. That's a record for the first 6 months of any year in the 45 years they've been keeping track. Think about the events behind that number. We had the catastrophic fires that tore through the hills of Los Angeles, looking like something out of a Michael Bay movie. We had a brutal spring tornado season that turned entire towns in the central and southern U.S. into splinters. That's over $40 billion in damage right there. We had atmospheric rivers in the west and derechos in the Midwest. This isn't a blip. It's the new tempo. This disaster industrial complex isn't a temporary feature, it's becoming a permanent, structural part of the American economy. We're on a treadmill of catastrophe. Break, fix, upgrade. Break, fix, upgrade. And the treadmill is speeding up. And this brings us to the great, terrifying paradox of our time. While one part of the world is getting terrifyingly good at cleaning up after climate-fueled disasters, the other part, the part that's supposed to be preventing them, seems to be completely stuck in the mud. Let's hop across the pond to Brussels. This very week, EU leaders are meeting to hash out their climate strategy. On the table is a bold, ambitious plan from the European Commission: slash emissions by 90% by the year 2040. Sounds great, right? Finally, some leadership. But hold your applause. The mood in Brussels is, shall we say, tense. An anonymous senior EU diplomat described the pre-summit negotiations as a delicate balance that could all unravel the moment the leaders actually start talking. Why? Because the real world is biting back. You have countries like Poland, still heavily reliant on coal, terrified of the economic shock. You have farmers across the continent protesting green regulations they say will bankrupt them. And you have the giant shadow of 2 other priorities that are screaming for money and attention: defense and trade. With the war in Ukraine still a grinding reality, every EU nation is under immense pressure to ramp up defense spending. At the same time, they're trying to avoid a trade war with both China and a potentially protectionist US, which means they're hesitant to slap carbon tariffs on imports or implement policies that might hurt their own industrial competitiveness. So what's happening? Climate action, the long-term preventative medicine, is slipping down the priority list. It's being sacrificed for the short-term political painkillers of placating voters, rearming, and protecting industry. And this is the fundamental, economically irrational choice that governments around the world are making. It's what political economist Abby Innes calls a failure to reimagine economics for the climate era. We are now running 2 economic models in parallel. Model A is the proactive model. This is the green transition. It involves massive upfront investment in renewable energy, grid modernization, energy efficiency, sustainable agriculture, and carbon capture. This model creates millions of jobs, spurs innovation, and, here's the key, prevents future economic damage by stabilizing the climate. The economic benefits are immense, but they are long-term, diffuse, and often invisible. You don't get a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a hurricane that didn't happen. Model B is the reactive model. This is the disaster industrial complex. This model waits for the disaster to strike and then spends trillions to clean it up. It also creates jobs, spurs innovation, in things like flood barriers and fire-retardant materials, and drives the 36% of GDP growth we talked about. Its benefits are immediate, highly visible, and politically popular. A governor who swoops in with relief funds and oversees a rapid rebuild is a hero. A politician who passes a carbon tax to prevent a flood 20 years from now is, often, unemployed. Right now, we are talking a big game about Model A, but we are dumping almost all of our real money and energy into Model B. We are choosing to become world-class paramedics for a patient we are simultaneously refusing to vaccinate. Think about the incentives. If you're a corporation, there's a massive, guaranteed, government-backed market in disaster recovery. Every storm, every fire, is a business opportunity. The insurance industry, for its part, is simply pulling out of high-risk areas like Florida and California or jacking up premiums to astronomical levels, effectively privatizing the cost of inaction onto homeowners. We have created a system where it is more politically expedient and, for some sectors, more immediately profitable to let things break and then fix them, rather than to invest in not letting them break in the first place. This is the full, terrifying picture that the headlines about storms and summits don't give you. The narrative isn't just climate change is bad. The narrative is that we have built a powerful and resilient economic engine that runs on the consequences of climate change. So we find ourselves in 2025, in a truly bizarre state of affairs. We're pouring concrete for sea walls with one hand while subsidizing the fossil fuels that make the seas rise with the other. We're celebrating the ingenuity of our disaster response while ignoring the spectacular failure of our disaster prevention. Which brings me back to that gravel. That clean, new gravel under the tracks in Asheville. It is, in its own way, a beautiful thing. It's a symbol of our incredible capacity to rebuild, to cooperate on a massive scale, to reboot civilization from scratch. It's a monument to the resilience of the human spirit and the quiet, awesome power of the global supply chain. But it's also a warning siren. Every time we see that new gravel, it means a place has been torn apart. Every dollar of that 36% of GDP growth is a dollar we spent because something was lost. We are celebrating our economy's ability to recover from self-inflicted wounds. The real question for the 21st century isn't whether we can afford the green transition. It's how much longer we can afford not to. The disaster industrial complex is a powerful engine, but it's fueled by loss and devastation. And the bill is getting bigger every single year. Sometimes, the most important economic stories aren't found in spreadsheets or stock tickers. Sometimes, you find them in the gravel under the tracks. That's all the time we have for today. Stay curious, stay critical. I'll see you next time on Boss Economic World.